Most music lists will tell you about artists who were mislabeled as one-hit wonders. Artists who actually had deep catalogs that nobody bothered to find. This is not that list. This is the honest version. These are 12 artists who genuinely, truly, had one significant moment, one record that broke through, one song that found an audience, and then the mainstream closed the door behind them. Not because they were not talented. Some of these records are extraordinary. Some of them shaped the sound of their era in ways that more celebrated artists built entire careers on top of. But the moment came. The moment passed. And most people today cannot name the artist attached to a record they have probably heard 100 times. 12 genuine one-hit wonders. 60 years of soul and R&B. Every single one of them deserves to be heard, name attached, story told, credit finally given. Number 12. Yarbrough and Peoples, Don't Stop the Music. 1981. Kevin Yarbrough and Elisa Peoples were a husband and wife duo from Dallas, Texas. And Don't Stop the Music is the kind of record that spreads not because a machine pushes it, but because people keep telling each other about it. Unhurried, completely confident in its own groove. A record that understood exactly what it was and did not need to be anything else. It reached the top 10. And became one of the most recognizable R&B records of the early 1980s. Club DJs held on to it. Radio programmers in certain markets kept it in rotation long after the national conversation had moved on. And then nothing followed at the same level. The duo continued recording. Don't Waste Your Time received some attention several years later, but the national mainstream found them once, through this specific record, and did not return. That is genuinely one of the more puzzling outcomes on this list, because Don't Stop the Music demonstrates a musical intelligence and a production clarity that should have opened doors rather than closing them. The record is not a fluke. It is too deliberate, too precisely constructed to be accidental. What it is a moment, a perfect, unrepeatable moment. And sometimes that is all the music industry allows an artist to have. Number 11. The Floaters, Float On. 1977. Float On is one of those records that operates on a completely different frequency from most of what surrounded it on the charts. In 1977. 4 members of the group each introduced themselves by name and astrological sign, Cancer, Leo, Libra, Aquarius, and then describe, in the most unhurried and self-assured terms imaginable, exactly what they are looking for in a woman. It sounds like it should not work. On paper, it reads like a novelty. In practice, it is one of the most effective seduction records ever committed to tape because the confidence is so complete, so entirely without apology, that it becomes genuinely magnetic. It went to number 2 on the pop charts and number 1 on the R&B charts. ABC Records, summer of 1977. It was everywhere. And then the Floaters essentially disappeared from national consciousness. The follow-up singles did not replicate the crossover success.
Cancer, and my name.
The formula that had worked so completely, once the introductions, the zodiac signs, the unhurried romantic declaration, was not something that could simply be repeated. It had worked because it was specific. The specificity could not be manufactured a second time. Float On remains one of the most purely itself records of its entire decade. That is its legacy. One moment, completely, permanently, its own.
And my name is Charles.
But before we go any further, if nobody ever told you about this channel, think about how close you came to never finding this. Don't let that happen to somebody else, and don't let it happen to you again. Hit subscribe right now, turn on notifications, because where we're going next in this story, you cannot afford to tap out. All right, Now back to it. Number 10. Brick. Dazz. 1976. Brick were an Atlanta-based funk group at a moment when Atlanta was not yet the recognized center of black music that it would eventually become. The city had a scene. It had talent. It had a specific regional sound that was developing its own identity separate from Philadelphia, Detroit, and the other established centers of soul and R&B production. Dazz, a portmanteau of disco and jazz coined by the group themselves, reached the top 10 on the pop charts and was nominated for a Grammy Award for Best R&B Song. For a regional group without the promotional infrastructure of a major label operating at full power, that was a significant commercial achievement. The record itself is a masterclass in the specific kind of tight. A groove-forward funk that Atlanta musicians were developing in the mid-70s, saxophone-led, rhythmically disciplined, warm without being soft. It sounds like a band that has been playing together long enough to communicate without speaking. The follow-up singles did not break nationally. Brick continued recording and performing, but the mainstream door that Dazz had briefly opened did not stay open. 1 Grammy nomination, 1 top 10 record, 1 moment when Atlanta funk was briefly visible to an audience that then looked away. The record remains, and it remains excellent. Number 9. BT Express. Do It Till You're Satisfied. 1974. 1974 is a transitional moment in the history of black music.
What they like to do, whatever it is, do it.
The point where funk and soul were beginning to absorb the rhythmic and production influences that would eventually become disco, while still retaining the raw, more organic qualities of the preceding decade. BT Express lived directly on that fault line. Do It Till You're Satisfied. Reached number 2 on the pop charts and number 1 on the R&B charts. It was produced by Jeff Lane and released on Roadshow Records, a smaller label that lacked the distribution and promotional machinery to sustain the momentum the record had generated. The group had a follow-up with Express that reached the charts in 1975, which complicates their strict one-hit wonder status slightly. But the national mainstream footprint was concentrated almost entirely in that first moment. Do It was the record that introduced them. It was also, for most audiences, the record that defined and concluded them simultaneously. What the record represents that specific transitional moment between funk and disco, executed with complete rhythmic authority, is something that very few records from that year captured as cleanly. BT Express understood exactly where the music was going and recorded something that belonged to both the moment it came from and the moment it was moving toward. Number 8. Bobby Byrd, Hot Pants, true 1971. The Bobby Byrd story is one of the most remarkable and most melancholy origin stories in the history of soul music. And it is almost never told. Bobby Byrd was James Brown's best friend and closest musical collaborator from the very beginning. When Brown was released from reform school as a teenager in Georgia, it was Bobby Byrd's family that took him in. It was Bobby Byrd's group, the Famous Flames, that Brown joined first as a member, and then gradually, through the force of his personality and talent, began to dominate. Byrd sang backgrounds on virtually every significant James Brown record of the 1960s. His voice is present on the most important funk records ever made. He co-wrote material. He performed on stage. He was, by any honest accounting, on one of the most important supporting figures in the entire Brown operation. Hot Pants was his solo moment, a King Records release that charted and demonstrated what his voice could do when it was the center of the production, rather than the background of someone else's. It was one moment. Because James Brown's gravitational pull was simply too strong, the commercial oxygen around the entire operation flowed back to Brown. Always. Inevitably. Regardless of how talented the people in his orbit were. Bobby Byrd spent his career making Brown's records extraordinary. The industry gave him one record of his own. That imbalance is its own story. Number 7. The Astors. Candy. 1965. The Astors were on Stax Records in 1965. Which means they were working at one of the most creatively significant labels in American music at the precise moment that label was defining its sound and establishing its identity. McLemore Avenue in Memphis, the Booker T and the MG's house band, the raw, live, physically immediate production aesthetic. That was the deliberate opposite of everything Motown was doing. In that environment, with those resources available to every artist on the roster, Candy is a perfect piece of Memphis soul. Tight, direct, rhythmically exact, every element in the right place serving the song rather than the arrangement. But Stax in 1965 had Otis Redding, Sam and Dave, Wilson Pickett recording there. The promotional machinery had finite capacity, and it was pointed at the names already generating the most attention. The Astors got one record through the noise. Candy found its audience modest, but real. And then the infrastructure moved on and took the available attention with it. This is not a story about talent. Candy is too good for that to be the explanation. It is a story about position, about where an artist sits in a label's hierarchy at a given moment, and how position, more than talent, determines which records become landmarks and which ones become footnotes. Number 6. The Jimmy Castor Bunch, Troglodyte, Caveman, 1972. Jimmy Castor was a musician's musician, a saxophonist who had been working professionally since the 1950s, recording doo-wop as a teenager, developing the kind of deep instrumental knowledge that only comes from years of working inside multiple genres simultaneously. Troglodyte was his moment with the mainstream, a comedic funk record built around a call-and-response vocal about prehistoric man that hit the top 5 pop charts in 1972. The horn arrangement is genuine. The rhythm section is locked. The comedy is committed. It is a record that understands exactly how to make a joke work musically, which is a considerably rarer skill than it sounds. It introduced a specific kind of comedic funk to pop audiences who had not been paying attention to that corner of the music. Parliament Funkadelic were developing their own brand of absurdist funk in the same era. But Castor arrived in the mainstream first through a cleaner, more accessible entry point.
The tree. She started to crush him.
The pop mainstream found Troglodyte, laughed with it, and then filed Jimmy Castor under novelty, and moved on, which was the same mistake that was made with Joe Tex, and Skinny Legs and all. A comedian with a saxophone is still a musician. The comedy does not cancel the craft. Jimmy Castor was both, and the mainstream only had room for one half of that equation.
At home, listening to his stereo.
Number 5. Chairman of the Board. Give Me Just a Little More Time. 1970. Holland Dozier Holland left Motown in a royalty dispute and founded Invictus Records. The pedigree behind that label was not minor. These were the songwriters and producers responsible for some of the most celebrated records in Motown's catalog. Four tops: Supremes, Marvin Gaye. They left because they were not being compensated fairly for what they had built. They started their own operation because they understood, better than almost anyone, how the music business actually worked. Chairman of the board was one of Invictus's flagship acts. General Johnson's voice warm, slightly melancholy, immediately distinctive, delivered "Give Me Just a Little More Time" to the top 5 on the pop charts in 1970. The label also had Patches in the same year, which muddies the one-hit wonder designation slightly. But in terms of sustained national mainstream recognition, the chairman of the board run was concentrated and brief. The infrastructure that should have amplified what they built was not powerful enough, or not pointed correctly enough, to convert a genuine top 5 hit into a lasting commercial presence. Holland Dozier Holland understood the machine. They had built it at Motown, but replicating it independently without the distribution, without the promotional relationships, without the full commercial infrastructure, proved more difficult than their talent warranted. General Johnson deserved a longer run. The record proves it. Number 4. The Dramatics. In the Rain. 1972. In the Rain is one of the most purely beautiful soul records of the 1970s. That is not an overstatement.
Think I'm gonna cry.
That is a statement about a record that does everything the soul ballad tradition asks of a record: harmonic sophistication, emotional precision, a lead vocal performance that communicates vulnerability without collapse, and does all of it at the highest possible level. The Dramatics were on Volt Records, the Stax subsidiary, and In the Rain was their biggest mainstream moment. The lead vocal, Ron Banks, navigating a melody of genuine complexity with the kind of ease that only emerges from serious musical preparation, is the record's defining element. It sounds effortless. It is not effortless, and it is the product of a group that had been developing its specific harmonic identity for years before this record found its audience. The mainstream paid attention once. The record reached the top 5 on the pop charts, and then the promotional machinery that could have sustained the momentum was not deployed effectively enough to convert the moment into a career. The Dramatics continued recording and performing for years. Ron Banks died in 2010. The catalog they left behind rewards serious listening, but for the national pop mainstream, In the Rain was the arrival and the departure simultaneously, one extraordinary record that opened a door, and then, through no fault of the music, found that door closing behind it. Number 3. The Soul Survivors. Expressway to Your Heart. 1967. Play the opening of this record for anyone who grew up around soul music. Watch their body respond before their brain catches up. The groove is that immediate, that physically compelling, that completely sure of exactly what it is doing. Now ask them who made it. The Soul Survivors were embedded in the early Philadelphia soul scene. At the precise moment that scene was beginning to understand what it was going to become. Kenny Gamble, who would go on to co-found Philadelphia International Records and reshape the entire sound of R&B for the following decade, was already in their orbit, the infrastructure being built around them. Would eventually produce some of the most important records in soul history, but not for them. The Philadelphia sound evolved and accelerated, and the resources concentrated around different names. The Soul Survivors were left at the on-ramp while the expressway kept moving, which is one of the more pointed ironies available in the entire history of soul music, given the title of their one significant record. They followed it with Explosion in Your Soul. It did not replicate the crossover. The mainstream had found them through one specific moment and was already looking elsewhere. Expressway to Your Heart remains one of the purest distillations of what Philly soul sounded like before Philadelphia International formalized the language. One record, one moment, an entire sound contained in a single groove. Number 2. The Swingin' Medallions. Double Shot of My Baby's Love. 1966. There is a specific category of perfect record that does not ask anything of the listener except presence. No context required, no prior relationship with the artist, no emotional preparation, just the record and the immediate, involuntary physical response it produces from the first downbeat. Double Shot is that record. Top 20 pop in 1966. Irresistible from the first measure. A party record in the purest sense, not a record about a party, but a record that is a party, that creates the atmosphere and the energy and the permission to abandon seriousness simply by existing. The Swingin' Medallions were a live band from South Carolina. With a genuine following across the Southeast, built through years of performance rather than promotional machinery. That regional audience understood from the beginning that Double Shot was the nationally visible tip of something with real roots. The national audience had no such context. They heard the record, embraced it, and when nothing followed at the same level of mainstream visibility, filed the group away under the convenient and inaccurate assumption that the one record was the whole story. It was not the whole story, but for the purposes of this list, for the purposes of what the national mainstream actually received and retained, it was the only chapter the country ever read. One record, one summer. One of the great pure party moments in the history of American popular music. Number 1, Fontella Bass. Rescue Me, 1965. Number 1 on this list for a specific reason. Not because it is the most obscure record here, it is the opposite of obscure. Not because the story behind it is the most dramatic, though it is dramatic, but because Rescue Me represents more completely than any other entry on this list the full complexity of what it means to be a genuine one-hit wonder in the soul tradition. The record is immediately recognizable. That horn intro, that groove, that voice arriving with the specific urgency of someone who has been waiting her entire life to deliver this one performance. It has been in commercials, films, television shows, and playlists for 60 years. It is embedded in the cultural memory of multiple generations. And almost no one can tell you who sang it. Fontella Bass was a Chess Records artist with gospel roots that went back to her grandmother, a sanctified church singer in St. Louis. She had been performing professionally since her teenage years. She was not an accident. She was a working musician who the mainstream found once and then immediately lost track of. The aftermath of Rescue Me contains the detail that elevates this story beyond the standard one-hit wonder narrative. American Express used the song in a national television commercial decades after its release without permission and without compensation. Fontella Bass had to sue to recover the rights to her own voice, her own legacy. A corporation had used the most recognizable thing she ever created to sell financial products, while she saw nothing. She won, but she should never have had to fight. One record. "60 years of recognition without attribution. A lawsuit to reclaim her own name. That is the one-hit wonder story told in its most complete and most honest form. and Fontella Bass, who deserved far more from the industry than she received, is where this list ends.